It's really too bad we didn't get to discuss The Great Gatsby together this year. It is my favorite novel to talk about with students because so many of you have great insights and opinions into the novel, and because my understanding of this book has really grown from my first reading of it in high school to teaching it now. There are so many things I usually talk about in the book that I couldn't possibly cover it all without this video being an hour long. Instead, I'm just going to try to focus on some of the things that I didn't understand in my first reading. And I think the easiest way to organize those insights is to talk about each of the main characters one at a time. So let's start with Tom Buchanan. Hulking, brutish, arrogant, racist Tom. There really isn't anything to like about him, is there? And not really much more to say, except that I do want to point out one thing about his wealth. He's clearly rich, but there's a big difference between the wealth of Tom and Daisy and the wealth of Gatsby that we see right at the start. Now, before we even meet Gatsby, Nick described his house as a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under thin-beard raw ivy. If you know something about social class, you might pick up right away that Gatsby is what people call new money. He was not born rich, but somehow came into his wealth. The stereotype of new money is that these people are less refined and less classy than people with old money. Compare the description of Gatsby's mansion as an imitation and brand spanking new with the description of the Buchanan's cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion. It's more understated, less gaudy and showy than Gatsby's enormous McMansion. So Tom and Daisy are from old money and Gatsby is new money, which is important for understanding why Tom despises Gatsby so much and why Daisy could not marry him. Which brings us to Daisy. Now, whenever we read this in class, I find that students are very quick to judge Daisy, especially when they find out she was in love with poor, penniless Gatsby and married wealthy Tom instead. Gold digger is the term that many students blurt out, and I hate that word. First of all, I think it's just very judgmental and dismissive, but it also ignores some very real social pressures that would have existed for Daisy. Remember that this is the 1920s, and as a young woman in America, especially a wealthy young woman, Daisy's only real duty in life is to marry well and continue her family's line. I cannot stress this enough. This is about more than money. Social class is just as much about status as it is about wealth. Remember, that's why Tom hates Gatsby. In our eyes, they're both rich, but for Tom, they do not belong in the same social group. And Daisy, coming from a wealthy family, had endured great pressure to marry within her social group. A lady of refinement like that just does not marry some poor soldier from the Midwest. I'm not saying that this is right, but I think that to brush all that aside and act like Daisy only married Tom because she wants money is to miss out on what's really going on. Now, the other thing that most readers hate about Daisy is her personality. She acts like a total ditz and says all kinds of silly and ridiculous things. But again, I think it's important to keep in mind what her station is in life. She is not expected to be an intelligent person with thoughts of her own. She's expected to look pretty and socialize with all the right people. That's what she's been taught to do her whole life. And there's a famous line she says, way back in chapter 1, I think is very revealing. She's talking about when she found out her baby was a girl. She said, "I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." This really speaks volumes about her. Why would Daisy say something like this unless something in her own experience has led her to believe that in this society, a woman born into a wealthy family is better off if she's a fool, if she's ignorant of what is going on around her? I think Daisy says this because she is not a fool. Daisy is much smarter and more self-aware than she lets on. She knows her husband is cheating on her, something that she just has to accept. It comes with the territory. And Daisy knows it would be a lot easier to live that way if she were more ignorant of pretty much everything. So I have a bit of sympathy for Daisy, but I also have some criticism, but I'll have to save that for later. Now, let's talk about Nick. Good, honest Nick, who says he never judges anybody. Now, laying aside the fact that he does judge just about everybody in this novel from beginning to end, let's take a look at how good and honest he really is. Now, to understand Nick, you have to read between the lines a bit. For one thing, the book is not primarily about him. He focuses much more on the drama between Tom, Daisy, and Gatsby. And for another, Nick does not think he's a bad guy. We all think we're the good guy in the story of our own lives. Of course, everything he does is right and justified in his own eyes. But the brilliant thing is that Fitzgerald has Nick drop enough details about himself into the story that if we look closely, we start to learn some things about him, and what we see does not paint a good picture. Our first indication is in chapter 1. Daisy asks Nick about a woman she heard he's engaged to. Nick is quick to clarify that they were not engaged, and he adds for the reader the fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. Now, a quick vocabulary note, a banns is an engagement announcement. So, in other words, Nick was serious with a girl, but there started to be rumors that they would get married. Nick didn't want that, but he also didn't want to break up with her, so he moved literally halfway across the country to New York to get away from her. What a nice boyfriend. Later on, in chapter 3, Nick is starting to get close to Jordan, and he says, "For a moment I thought I loved her, but I am slow thinking and full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires." Yes, Nick, you're so good and moral. He says, "I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangle back home." Again, read between the lines. Nick still hasn't broken up with that girl back home, and he's still been signing his letters to her, "Love, Nick," while starting up a relationship with Jordan at the same time. And while he's telling us about this, he praises himself for his morality because, he's keeping things casual with Jordan. Later on the same page, he has the audacity to claim, "I am one of the few honest people that I've ever known." Right. In case you're not yet convinced what an insensitive jerk Nick can be, there's another moment in chapter 4. He's just learned about Gatsby's love for Daisy, and he starts to think about his own love life. He says, "Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding sides, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms." Okay, so Nick doesn't have a girl he feels about the way Gatsby and Tom both feel about Daisy, but hey, here's Jordan, so I guess she'll do. Okay, there's more that I could say about Nick, but I'm going to leave him alone for a moment. Let's go on to Gatsby. The Great Gatsby, the romantic hero of the story, who never gave up on his love for Daisy. Gatsby, the embodiment of the American dream, born poor and created a fortune through nothing but his own hard work and determination, and he did it all just to win the love of the girl who got away. Let's see what the book has to say about this guy. First of all, I was being facetious just now in my description of him, because I think from the moment he's fully revealed in the book, it should be clear to us that the title of this novel is ironic. That Gatsby is in fact not great. There's a lot of buildup with all these mysteries and rumors surrounding him. He's talked about like some kind of legend. And then there's this brilliant scene in chapter 3. Nick is at Gatsby's party, and he's been talking to a bunch of random strangers, and he sits down at a table and is talking with yet another random guy, and they've been talking for a while when Nick casually mentions that he hasn't even met this Gatsby fellow yet, and when he's talking to, that he's been talking to this whole time, is taken back and says, "I'm Gatsby." That's it. That's the big reveal. He apologizes and says he's afraid he's not a very good host. I love the anticlimax of that scene. Later, it's Jordan who says it best. He's just a man named Gatsby. And from then on, I think that's the way Fitzgerald wants us to see him. Not as some great, tragic, romantic figure, just a guy named Gatsby. Now, let's go and talk about Gatsby the Romantic, because I think the book is actually very critical of him on this point. I mentioned this romantic idea that Gatsby amassed his small fortune to win Daisy back. He bought a mansion across the bay from her so that he can stand outside and look at the green light at the end of her dock. He throws these crazy parties where people just wander in uninvited, all in the hopes that one night one of those uninvited guests will be Daisy. This is the kind of stuff that might seem romantic in a movie, but if someone did that in real life, we would think they were a total creep. And it gets worse. My second favorite scene in this whole book is in chapter 6. Nick says about Gatsby, he wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, "I never loved you." After she had obliterated 3 years of that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. Now, it wasn't until I read that as an adult that I understood everything that's wrong with this. Gatsby doesn't just want Daisy to leave her husband. He wants to literally turn back the clock. He wants to get married in Daisy's old house, where they first fell in love all those years ago. But Gatsby doesn't understand that she's a different person now. She's married. She has a daughter. I noticed several of you in your notes wrote about the moment that Gatsby meets Daisy's daughter for the first time and how she never really seemed real to him until he saw her in person. Gatsby is in denial. He's delusional if he thinks that things can go back to the way they were. And trying to return to the past is only going to make him and the people he claims to care about miserable. And Nick knows this. He says to Gatsby, "I wouldn't ask too much of her. You can't repeat the past." Now, it sounds to me like Nick is trying to be a good friend. He's being tactful in the way he's wording this, saying, "I wouldn't ask too much of her." But Nick is saying that what Gatsby wants is not fair to Daisy. And he gives him a clear warning. You can't repeat the past. And of course, Gatsby's response is a very famous line. Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can. I can't tell you how wrong Gatsby is here and how damaging this kind of thinking is. And if you ask me, this is maybe the most important message of the novel. Now, we get to see this issue raised again in chapter 7 at the climax of the novel. This is my favorite scene in the whole book. Yes, I think the climax is not when Myrtle gets killed. It's in the argument that takes place in the hotel when Tom confronts Gatsby. Everything is out in the open now. Everybody knows who's sleeping with who, and Gatsby tells Daisy, practically commands her to tell Tom that she never loved him. And she says, in her own words now, "Oh, you want too much. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past." I love this moment because clearly Daisy is right. You can't help what's in the past. And if you obsess over that, you'll only end up driving yourself insane. And she's telling Gatsby that he's being unfair in asking her to say this thing that is clearly not true. She says, "I did love him once, but I loved you too." The reality of it is, the truth of it, is that Daisy did love Tom as awful and abusive as he is. And she loves Gatsby now. And that should be enough for him. And that's certainly all that Gatsby has the right to expect from her. But clearly, it's not enough for him. All right. There's a whole lot more that I could talk about in this book, but I think that's going to have to do it for now. Thanks for listening.